The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Popes Against the Modern Errors on the Restoration Radio Network. I am Stephen Heiner, and on this episode I'm joined by His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Brooksville, Florida, recovering from a sickness that kept us from recording this last month. I'm glad that you're on the road to recovery, Your Excellency.
Yes, you might hear some raspiness or some coughing. That's proof positive that I had the flu a few weeks ago, and I couldn't participate in the show. So unfortunately, because it was a good one, there were a lot of things that Bergoglio had said that I would have loved to have commented on, but I couldn't.
Well, I noted in the episode that at least someone from the Novus Ordo said the word heretic, so you were covered for the episode. You didn't have anything to worry about there. In this episode, we are moving onward in our treatment of encyclicals, which is the point of this series, Popes Against the Modern Errors. And today we're dealing with Quanta Cura, which was issued on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1864, December the 8th, rather. And on current errors is the popular English translation of the encyclical's title. And this was written by His Holiness Pope Pius IX. As I asked His Excellency to do in the previous episode when we covered Mirari Vos, I don't assume that our listeners are fully familiar with every single one of these popes. So I'm going to ask the bishop to give us a little bit of background on Pius IX, how he fits in within the paradigm of the pendulating papacy, and what sort of circumstances surrounded the release of this encyclical.
Yes, even since the 18th century, there was a pendulation going on. The problem in the 18th century was, how do we deal with regalism? That is, the interference of royal courts that are infected with Jansenism and Freemasonry and other things hostile to the church. How do we deal with that? Do we become intransigent? Do we risk persecution, or do we throw the chickens to alligators? In other words, do we appease them? And so that was the conflict of two parties in the 18th century, and one was called the Zelanti, and the other was called the Politicanti. That is, those who were zealous and the others who were essentially politicians. That's what they were called. It sounds worse than it is. It was simply two ways of looking at the problem, and both sides thought they had the prudent way of looking at it. By the French Revolution, though, things changed a great deal. French Revolution occurred in 1789, and its principles were condemned by Pius VI. He died in 1799. Pius VII was elected in 1800. He was elected as a person to be very conciliatory toward the revolutionary governments, particularly France. And so he pursued that all for 23 years. He died in 1823. For 23 years, he pursued that course. In so doing, and I won't go into all the details, but in so doing, he irritated the Roman cardinals, that is, the cardinals who were in Rome and who are assistants to the Pope, irritated them incredibly. And so when he died, they elected someone by the name of Leo XII, who was elected as someone who would react against the policies of Pius VII, the conciliatory policies toward the revolution. And Leo XII was very, very strong in condemning all of the revolutionary ideas and was not conciliatory toward revolutionary governments. He died in 1829, and there was elected Pius VIII, who switched back, and he was elected as a switchback to the policies of Pius VII, and he took his name in honor of Pius VII. And he lasted only about 2 years. And then Gregory XVI was elected in 1831, and he was very, very zelante, that is, very anti-accommodationist, anti-soft with regard to the revolutionary governments. And so he always pursued a very hard line with regard to any of those things, both doctrinally and in the practical order. When he died in 1846, you had a very strong reaction against him among a lot of the higher clergy. And so there was a type of battle, you might say, there was always a battle in the conclave between the followers of Gregory XVI, who would have elected his Secretary of State, Lambruschini, and the politicanti, that is, those who favored a more softer approach toward the revolutionary ideas and the ideas of liberalism, and they were supporting Mastai Ferretti, who was known for his liberal ideas. He was the bishop of Imola in Italy, and he won the election in 1846, in the summer of 1846, and delivered on his promise to be conciliatory toward liberal ideas. So he made a lot of reforms in the Papal States. He actually arranged that the government of the Papal States be in the hands of lay people. And he did this with the idea of conciliation, that if we give in to the demands of the liberals in Italy who want who are nationalistic and who want a country, if we give in to their demands, they will be satisfied and we can move on. We won't have all of this tumult in Italy about creating an Italian republic and all. So, well, that lasted 2 years until the incident of the slitting of the throat of Count Rossi in the courtyard of the Quirinal Palace in 1848, where the liberals, fearful that Pius IX's reforms would actually have the desired effect that Pius IX wanted, they decided that we have to be more radical. And so during the very ceremony of inauguration of this lay minister for the Papal States, they slit his throat in front of everybody. And then literally all hell broke loose in Rome. Garibaldi came in, who was a Freemason and a radical anti-Catholic. He came in with his troops and overran Rome and spread pornography all over the city, raped nuns, and did all sorts of horrid things with sacred vessels. And it was just a dirty, horrid mess. And Pope Pius IX fled Rome dressed as a simple priest and went to Gaeta, which is to the south in the Kingdom of Naples. Because of that experience with the liberals, Pius IX became totally transformed into something that exceeded Gregory XVI and Leo XII, all of his predecessors, with regard to anti-accommodationism.
Well, if something like that doesn't change you, Your Excellency, I mean, there's something wrong, right?
Yes. I mean, he saw that throwing chickens to the alligators was not a good idea. And so it really opened his eyes as to the malice of these people who were asking for these reforms and who were trying to, manipulate him with regard to his ideas. And so he became, that switch just totally shocked all of the people that supported him originally, because he became more hardline even than Gregory XVI. And he lasted, that was 1848, he lasted 30 years until 1878. He has the longest reign of any pope in history, from 1846 to 1878. And his pontificate is marked by a very strong intransigence toward liberalism and many condemnations of liberalism. And this encyclical Quanta Cura is one example of his anti-liberal attitude. The occasion of it, it did not have a specific occasion like Mirari Vos, where Gregory XVI was responding to works of Lamennais, as a specific priest in France who was making a lot of trouble. This was something on Pius IX's mind, the condemnation of modern errors. What did spark it, though, was a speech in Malines, which is in Belgium, by a liberal Catholic by the name of Montalembert, French, very, very famous, and had been a follower of Lamennais, who was condemned by Gregory XVI. He was the prime example of a liberal Catholic. By the way, Pius IX said at one point in his pontificate that the liberal Catholics are the worst enemies of the Church. So Montalembert gives a speech calling for a free church in a free state. That means there should be separation of church and state. The church should be able to do whatever it pleases. The state should be able to do whatever it pleases, and they don't have to bother with each other. That was the liberal ideal. It's actually what exists in the United States of America and always did exist. So all of those Europeans, those liberal Europeans, look to America, which is a secularized state which professes no religion, as an ideal, because the church can flourish in that atmosphere. And so they thought, well, if the church can flourish in that atmosphere, it must be the best solution. So he gives this speech, and it's well known, and he's well known, and so it makes its rounds in Europe. And Pius IX uses that as a reason or an occasion to make this encyclical Quanta Cura. So he is responding to some of these things that Montalembert said.
Well, I had mentioned it was released on December the 8th, and I was unsure for a moment because I thought when was the Immaculate Conception defined, and it was 10 years earlier in 1854. So this is 10 years after the dogma of the Immaculate Conception had been pronounced.
Yes, he was very devoted to the Immaculate Conception.
Well, I want to kind of jump right into that. Was an excellent introduction, Your Excellency. I want to jump right into the encyclical, and if we look at paragraph 2, the title is "Grievous Errors Flourish," and I thought to myself as I was preparing for this episode and just reviewing the encyclical again that things sound pretty bad in 1864. You know, you would think that he was saying this in 2015 or something, but if you listen to these phrases, we condemn the chief errors of this most unhappy age. They should altogether abhor and flee from the contagion of so dire a pestilence. We condemned the monstrous portents of opinion which prevail especially in this age, bringing with them the greatest loss of souls and the detriment of civil society itself. Things sound pretty terrible in 1864.
They are terrible. The whole 19th century was terrible for the Catholic Church. There was an attempt to put Europe back together in 1814 in the Congress of Vienna and make everything normal and straight again. But that didn't last. And even though they attempted to do that, they left out the Catholic faith from that restoration that was done in 1814. And so these errors of the revolution, liberalism and anti-clericalism and interference in the church and suppression of the church were still very much alive. And so we saw many cases, most people are not familiar with how much the church suffered in the early part of the 19th century with the closing of churches, the persecution of the clergy, imprisonment of bishops. That was in Germany. That was in Cologne. A bishop was imprisoned because he wouldn't go along with the government. persecution of Catholics in Belgium by the Protestant overlords of Holland, persecution of Catholics in Poland by the Russian Tsar, persecution of Catholics in South America by various dictators who were anti-Catholic and Freemasonic, Spain and Portugal, the stripping of churches and suppression of religious orders and all sorts of persecution. I can't go into it, but there were fires. And then Italy itself, which was on fire about nationalism and doing away with the papal states. The whole of Europe was one big problem, with the exception of England. But all of the continent, from Russia all the way through to Spain, there was a revolution against the church, and the church suffered a great deal in this time. It was like everywhere there were problems and hostility. And then, as I said, most of South America was in revolt. Mexico was in revolt against the church. The only place that looked good, or the only places that looked good, were England, Great Britain in general, and the United States of America. Pope Gregory XVI had said, "There is nowhere that I am more Pope than in the United States of America." Canada, Australia. Things were going well. The rest of the world was, with the exception of the mission countries, but where the church had been established for a long time, most of that world was in revolt against the church, was persecuting the church, and things looked very dire, whether the church would even survive all of this attitude. So that's the background of Pius IX's words here, is that we are in a very, very bad state. There is a revolt in Italy against him. In 1870, he will lose the Papal States. There is a revolt in Italy against him, and the Carbonari and the other secret societies, the Freemasons, are spreading all of this evil doctrine among the people. The people are eating it up. There is a great loss of faith, great loss of piety. That's what is behind all these strong words. These are really bad times that don't have a precedent in the history of the church.
Well, and even though, as you mentioned, the church is flourishing in these countries that, shall we say, have no baggage. There's no long history and unity of church and state as was in the European powers. He doesn't sign off on that being a good thing. While the church may be flourishing in this secular context, he says in the second paragraph, in fact, he calls it, he cites Gregory XVI of felicitous memory. He says that this is an insanity that, quote, liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society. And that sort of phrasing sounds very familiar to me, Your Excellency.
Yes. They did not have cut and paste back in the Vatican II days, but if they copy and paste, but if they had it, they could have just easily lifted what is condemned by Pope Pius IX and by Pope Gregory XVI and put it into Vatican II, because that's what it seems to be. If you compare the Declaration on Religious Liberty in Vatican II, it's as if they just lifted it out. It says in this document, the Vatican Synod declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups or of any human power in such wise that in matters religious, no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, nor is anyone to be restrained from acting in accordance with his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others within due limits. And the document goes on and says that this is based on human dignity, which in turn is based on revelation. So we are to believe then that God has revealed that the primacy of the human conscience is that he has revealed this, and this is in accordance with human dignity. It says again a few paragraphs later, it is to no one is to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in matters religious. See, this is the insanity that.
To be clear, Your Excellency, you're reading from Dignitatis Humanae.
Yes, Dignitatis Humanae.
What are the paragraph numbers that you're reading from?
That is in what I just read was paragraph 3. The first one was from paragraph 1. So let's see, in paragraph 3, still it says the religious bodies rightfully claim freedom in order that they may govern themselves according to their own norms, honor the Supreme Being, whoever he is, in public worship, assist their members in the practice of religious life, strengthen them by instruction, and promote institutions in which they may join together for the purpose of ordering their own lives in accordance with their religious principles. This is absolutely against the condemnations of Gregory XVI and Pope Pius IX. Now, Pope Pius IX says this is in paragraph 3 of Quanta Cura, he says, and against the doctrine of Scripture, very important, of the Church and of the Holy Fathers. So he mentions 3 things there: the doctrine of Scripture, the doctrine of the Church, and of the Holy Fathers. That means the Fathers of the Church. They do not hesitate to assert that, and this is a quote, that it is the best condition of civil society in which no duty is recognized as attached to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. So that means that is heretical. It is heretical to say that the best condition of civil society is one in which there is no constraint put on the practice of false religions. That's a heresy, because it's against the teaching of the Church, against the teaching of sacred Scripture, and against the teaching of the Holy Fathers. That's extremely important. So
what is condemned in this encyclical, Your Excellency, is the teaching of the Novus Ordo Sect.
Yes, and it's so clear. You see, Vatican II was very good at making sandwiches. That is, you would have 2 pieces of bread, that is, Catholic doctrine, and then in between you have the error. So it would, on the one hand, assert Catholic doctrine. In the next paragraph, it would say, however, and then it would assert something false. The idea being that Catholics could look at the first paragraph and neglect to look at the second, and the liberals could look at the second and neglect to look at the first. That's how it passed. That it served up a smorgasbord that had both good food and poison in it. And so those who were concerned about Vatican II look only at those paragraphs in which there is Catholic doctrine asserted. So that's how Vatican II passed and continues to pass among Novus Ordo conservatives. The Quanta Cura continues, referring to what Gregory XVI called an insanity, that liberty of conscience and worship is each man's personal right, which ought to be legally proclaimed and asserted in every rightly constituted society, and that a right resides in the citizens to an absolute liberty, which should be restrained by no authority, whether ecclesiastical or civil, whereby they may be able openly and publicly to manifest and declare any of their ideas whatever, either by word of mouth, by the press, or in any other way. And Vatican II asserts that people have this right. And Pius IX continues, but while they rashly affirm this, they do not think and consider that they are preaching the liberty of perdition. He says that if human arguments are always allowed free room for discussion, there will never be wanting men who will dare to resist truth, to trust in the flowing speech of human wisdom, whereas we know from the very teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ how carefully Christian faith and wisdom should avoid this most injurious babbling.
Most injurious babbling.
Clear as could be.
I can think of at least one person who's guilty of that most injurious babbling.
Yes. So, I mean, this is an important document for Catholics because there is a direct contradiction, and this is even admitted by honest modernists. Yves Congar said, "Oh yes, there's a contradiction, but it's only a material one." Whatever that means. But other modernists, your radical modernists, yes, the Church has evolved on this. When John Paul I was elected, one of the things he said in the first few days after his election was the Church was wrong on religious liberty, meaning and what he meant by it, if you look at the context, that the Quanta Cura was wrong, that the Church had it wrong in the 19th century. So they know that it does definitely contradict. The only people that say it doesn't contradict are the Novus Ordo conservatives, who have been looking at a naked emperor for 50 years and have been talking about his wonderful new clothes. And
right. The hermeneutic of continuity.
Yes. Yes. There was a priest recently, a Novus Ordo priest recently, who blew me off. He said, "Please don't bother me anymore with all of your stuff." I think sedevacantism is absurd. And he said, "I believe in the hermeneutic of continuity." Because my question to him is, how do you justify all of these things? You have a very clear contradiction in all of these things. What's your way of clearing this contradiction up? Please tell me. And that's what he came back with. It was like thunder and lightning. And he said, "I believe in the hermeneutic of continuity," as if in a blind way. He cannot say what that continuity is. But it's a blind faith that's somewhere out there. There's a hermeneutic of continuity. There is some solution that somebody has, like a key to a door, that will solve all the problems. And that was the question I put to him. If it's there, why don't we know it? Why doesn't somebody tell us, and then we can have our consciences corrected, and everything will be all right. If there is a hermeneutic of continuity here, tell us about it. And that's what I got back. So I think I hit a hot button there.
that happens, Jesse. I'm sure you're used to that. When you think about this, we are living in a modern society in which the idea that you're allowed to say whatever you want is a given. And even the Novus Ordo Sect, which is playing the role of the Catholic Church to many people who don't know better, goes along with this idea, as you pointed out. Mm-hmm. But I have to imagine that if we lived in an earlier age and we weren't Catholic, that counterintuitively, someone who was saying that you couldn't say anything you wanted might actually be a beacon of light for people to move towards. They might be attracted to that and say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Why is not everything permitted? And I think that might have been something attractive because it was so against the ideas of the age. And these ideas were coming to birth for everybody. They were new ideas at the time. They're very old ideas for us. But at the time, this was just bursting forth, as you say, like a virus all over Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yes. First of all, and my comment to that would be, there is no true freedom of conscience and freedom of thought and freedom of speech. In every society, there is a restriction of those things. Just look at what is politically correct. Look at politically incorrect. You get fried today, just completely burned, if you say something that is politically incorrect, which would have been totally acceptable in the 1950s, say. Mm-hmm. All of the discrimination, the so-called discrimination against homosexuals, that that was something that was, I mean, they were arrested in the 1950s. And now you can't say anything against them for fear of being politically incorrect. So there is always a doctrine. The highest doctrine is the doctrine of liberalism. That is, that whatever society comes up with, whatever corruption should come down the line, we must assent to it and assent to people's right, to everyone's right to embrace it. If you don't assent to that, then there's something wrong with you. See, that there is always a dogma. Well, the liberalism was invented to destroy the dogma of Catholicism, but to replace it with its own dogma. So we are not totally free. We are free to deny the Catholic faith. We're free to blaspheme. We are free to say horrid things about Christ and the Virgin Mary. We're free to do all of those things. But we're not free to say many other things which would call down upon us government supervision. Very true. So, I mean, really, there is never a time in which there is so-called freedom of speech and freedom of thought. The other thing is that liberalism believes in a humanity that is not infected with original sin, and sees the general discussion of ideas, no matter what they are, no matter how depraved they are, the general discussion of ideas among human beings as something healthful, and that human beings will always go down the right road when they sit in judgment of all of these things that they read, which is an absurd, absolutely absurd notion. Human beings will sit in front of the television set and will parrot whatever the media tells them to think. And they'll sit and read their newspapers and just like sheep go to the slaughter. That is the reality. Ever since the newspaper appeared in the 18th century and the media appeared, the news media, the idea of people who are very intellectual sitting around discussing various ideas and arriving at the truth is just an absurdity. The liberalism is a tool of those who wish to replace the final vestiges of Christianity with a whole new world of secularism and of moral depravity, and that movement will end up in the Antichrist.
Well, and that segues very well into the next paragraph, Your Excellency. The Holy Father is glomming onto this idea of the replacement religion. You've got to fill in all the gaps that the Church used to occupy. And he starts the fourth paragraph. And since where religion has been removed from civil society and the doctrine and authority of divine revelation repudiated, the genuine notion itself of justice and human right is darkened and lost, and the place of true justice and legitimate right is supplied by material force. You need to have police to have a good society. And he goes on further in this paragraph. He says, the communists and socialists assert that, quote, domestic society or the family derives the whole principle of its existence from the civil law alone, and consequently that on civil law alone depend all rights of parents over their children, and especially that of providing for education.
Yes, that is very typical of liberalism. When you deny God and God's role in society and relegate religion to merely a private affair, then the question comes up: where does the civil authority get its power to tell you to do something? Why does a judge have the power to send you to the electric chair? Who is he? He's just a man. He puts on his pants in the morning just like you do. Now, who is he? Why does he have that power? And in the liberal system, he has that power because if you don't do that, the police will come and tie you up and shoot you or do some violence to you. Whereas in the Catholic system, he has that power from God. And so the whole idea of civil society works on the idea that it is a representative of God, and people are subject to the civil authority as they are to God. And just as the Pope has power from God to rule the church, so the ruler of a nation, however it is ruled, will have that power from God. So you take God out of that and you set up a liberal society, then you have a society based only on force and fear. Who is holding the gun? And who has the ability to force you to do something? And that is something that is extremely dangerous and leads to all kinds of problems, as we have seen in the world. Our country has been relatively stable for various reasons that I won't get into, but it's certainly capable of losing that stability. And we have seen incredible instability owing to this liberalism throughout the world in the past 200 years. Revolutions, how many RPMs, how many revolutions per minute have there been in South America and Mexico and all of these other places? The revolutions in Europe. There is when you pull God out of society, then the mob becomes God, and the general will becomes the will of God, so to speak. The other thing about liberalism is that it will not recognize anything except the individual. That is, it will not recognize the family. It will not recognize the church. It will not actually even recognize the rights of business and other societies, secular societies. There is the all-powerful state, and then there is the individual. So it reaches down into all of those societies, and particularly the family, and dictates to children and to wives and to other members of the family, apart from the father of the family. So all you are is a citizen with regard to the state. There are no other considerations, and so the family becomes just a house in which people live. It is not a true domestic society in the ideas of liberalism, and that's what he's talking about.
And as you're saying that, I think you referenced South America, and I think that's where our minds go when we think about these revolutions. But obviously, living here in France, I thought about two things as you said that. One, on the birth certificate, on the marriage certificate, even though it still has places for 10 children, I don't know how you have 10 children in a contracepting society. There's still 10 spaces to put your kids' names. It says parent 1 and parent 2, right? And then in Notre Dame, where I go usually at least once a week with guests for my business, there often, whenever I'm in there, I try to close my eyes and remember the idea of the temple of reason. That, as you say, the state becomes God, and at the time, a 700-year-old cathedral becomes the quote unquote temple of reason. So this isn't just stuff that happens far away. Even in the heart of quote unquote civilization, the revolution, the state will take everything.
And don't forget, that was a prostitute, that goddess of reason that was worshipped in Notre Dame was a prostitute who was dressed up as the Virgin Mary. She had a blue mantle on. It was, and on the altar were busts of Rousseau, Franklin, and Voltaire.
Oh, the horrible people. We'll use those horrible people as a segue into the document that accompanied this. Now, when we think about the Syllabus of Errors and Quanta Cura, these two things are linked together. Can you explain just how they're related in terms of in the encyclical and this list? Had we ever seen anything like this before? We talked before about Universal Ordinary Magisterium and how we talked about that last episode and in the Zero episode as well. How does the Syllabus of Errors fall into this?
It was a document put out in order to, for two reasons. One, to organize the errors that have been condemned in various documents and allocutions and to remind the people of them and the bishops. Secondly, to condemn them anew, so that the document is not merely a list of things you should review. It is a list of condemned doctrines and condemned ideas. Now, so it has its own authority, and it was sent to the bishops together with Quanta Cura, and the bishops promulgated both of these documents solemnly. It was what you called universal ordinary magisterium. So hence both documents are infallible. If you look at the Quanta Cura, he is explicit about the authority of Quanta Cura. He says, therefore, by our apostolic authority, we reprobate, that means we disapprove of, we proscribe and condemn all the singular and evil opinions and doctrines severally mentioned in this letter, and will and command that they be thoroughly held by all the children of the Catholic Church as reprobated, proscribed, and condemned. That formula has all of the characteristics necessary for what we call a solemn magisterium.
And that's in paragraph 6 that the bishop was reading, if you're following along.
Yes. That is the language of solemn magisterium. He cites his apostolic authority, and he demands that all hold to what he has, in other words, hold as condemned what he has condemned. So there is no wriggling out of this. I mean, so that means that Vatican II teaches something that he has infallibly condemned as erroneous, which
it's so negative, Your Excellency. I mean, reprobate, proscribe, condemn. I mean, where's the positivity here?
So Vatican II cannot wriggle out of it. There is this glaring contradiction, and it means that it is infallibly true that these things are erroneous and that these things are disapproved of and proscribed and condemned. So that means Vatican II is teaching condemned doctrine, what is infallibly condemned, because the Church is infallible not only in proposing the truth, but also in condemning those things that are opposed to the truth, as part of its role given to it by our Lord. It has that authority to not only propose, but also to condemn the opposite. And when it condemns something, that means the opposite of the condemned doctrine must be true. See, if I say A is condemned, then non-A must be true. See, that's the way it works in sacred doctrine. So that means that it is absolutely and infallibly true that societies must profess the Catholic faith, and it is infallibly true that it is wrong that there be religious liberty. See, so it's very clear. The syllabus is an infallible condemnation as well, because of the language used in presenting it to the bishops, that these are censured and that they are condemned. These are condemned propositions. So these are also infallibly condemned. Now, that doesn't mean that every single one of them is contrary to dogma. There are levels of condemnation. You could condemn something as being dangerous, or you could condemn something as being, as they say, offensive to pious ears, or simply as erroneous. See, it doesn't mean that every single thing in it is a heresy. You can condemn things with various levels, and Pius IX says, in order to determine the level of all of this, you have to go back to the document which is cited. See, so he cites the documents from which these condemnations are taken. So you have to understand them in that sense. But the syllabus in and of itself has its own condemnation of all of these things. There were some who tried to soften the syllabus, saying, well, it's just sort of a reminder of things that the Pope said in the past, and it really doesn't have its own authority. But very much it does have its own authority, and that's the way it was taken, and that's the way it was promulgated at the time. And it's very important.
Well, we can get into some of these condemnations, and so I want to remind our listeners that, well, first of all, I want to remind you that you're listening to Popes Against the Modern Errors, Episode 2. I'm Stephen Heiner, and you've been listening to His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn talk about Quanta Cura, Pius IX, the pendulating papacy, and the infallibility of both Quanta Cura and the syllabus. I want to remind our listeners, I'm going to be reading these propositions are condemned as false. So when I read these, I'm not approving of them, but neither is the church. These are things that are wrong. But you'll find in them the ring of modern truths, quote unquote. These are the things, these are the accepted notions of, polite society, maybe, Your Excellency?
Politically correct society, yes.
Politically correct society. Okay, so number 5, divine revelation is imperfect and therefore subject to a continual and indefinite progress, corresponding with the advancement of human reason.
That means evolution of dogma, which is one of the cornerstones of modernism. That divine revelation is continuing in each person. God reveals himself to each person, and therefore, as he reveals himself, the new things come to light. So that's why the modernists can say, well, yes, Council of Trent, that was true for its time, but now we know better, and things have progressed. And you're seeing this with Bergoglio, who is just becoming a very logical, and he is a very logical liberal. The liberal looks, as I said, at any situation and says we must somehow conform to it. We must conform Catholicism to the new situation, no matter how depraved it is. All right? If it exists, we must somehow make Catholicism relevant to it. See, that is the liberal mentality. It's a sort of personality thing. It's so deep in them. They can never oppose a doctrine, a modern doctrine. They can never say the church must take an intransigent stance against us. They are incapable of doing that. If it's there, we must have it. We must adapt to it. And so this very much is in accordance with that divine revelation is ongoing. It is the teaching of the church that divine revelation was closed at the death of the last apostle, and that there is no new revelation. That was Pius X who put that in Lamentability. So, this is just typical. Evolution of dogma is an absolute necessity for the modernists, because otherwise they find themselves condemned. And everything in the church condemns what is going on today. If they cannot cite evolution of dogma as their justification,
right,
then,
this is their way
then they're
in.
dead.
Right. There's
so they have to appeal to that.
There's a triple whammy that we've already that you've already covered quite well, Your Excellency, 15, 16, and 17, and those read respectively. 15, every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. 16, man may, in the observance of any religion whatever, find the way of eternal salvation and arrive at eternal salvation. Well, that's easy when there's no such thing as a Catholic God. And 17,
that's ecumenism.
Good hope, at least, is to be entertained of the eternal salvation of all those who are not at all in the true Church of Christ.
Yeah, that's ecumenism. That's what ecumenism holds, is that those who are outside of the Catholic Church through their own fault can somehow be saved, and that non-Catholic religions are means of salvation. That's Vatican II. It's interesting. Ratzinger, who is venerated as right now as the conservative old man and Mr. Orthodoxy, and who probably has the hermeneutic of continuity somewhere in his head. He was venerated by the Novus Ordo conservatives. He said in Vatican II that Gaudium et Spes was the anti-syllabus. Because the Gaudium et Spes, I talked about that in another show, is the document that says we must conform the church to the modern world effectively. I mean, it goes on and on and on, Gaudium et Spes, but that's the basic idea, is that the Catholic Church must be liberalized, must be modernized. And so it is the counter syllabus, because the syllabus is saying the Catholic Church must dig in against all of these modern errors and oppose them with all of its might. That's the sense of the syllabus if you were to read the whole thing. So that was a great victory for those radical modernists, of whom Ratzinger was, primary example, was Gaudium et Spes at Vatican II.
Yeah, I guess he's the eminence blanche these days of those people. 26 and 27, I want to lead back to the historical context of the theft of the Papal States, because I don't know if it's clear enough sometimes to Catholics how important having the Papal States was, what a right that was of the papacy, and why it's important. So 26, the Church has no innate and legitimate right of acquiring and possessing property, obviously, as we would see in the Civil Constitution and the disgusting laws here in France. And 27, the sacred ministers of the Church and the Roman Pontiff are to be absolutely excluded from every charge and dominion over temporal affairs. These are the people who want to get rid of all the Vatican embassies around the world, at least what they represent, even though they didn't have true people in them. Can you relate this to the temporal power of the Church? Why was it important, and what a loss it was for us to lose the Papal States?
Yes, it is very important, just as a general principle, that the Church not be subject to any civil power. It wants to work with civil power, because man is composed of body and soul, and therefore works well with civil power, but it should never be subject to civil power. It is also very important for the universality of the Church that it not be identified with any one nation. It is not the Greek Orthodox Church where everybody has to eat baklava after Mass. It is not the Russian Orthodox Church where you have borscht or something else after Mass. It's not the Church of England where you have the crumpets and whatnot. What I'm pointing out is that there is no identification with any one particular culture or nation. That it is an institution which is above all of those things. It is supranational. It is not international. It is supranational. That means it's above all nations. Therefore, it is extremely important, even essential, that it have its own territory, so that it belongs to no part of this world. It has its own territory, and that it own its own churches, and that it have an independence in that sense of all secular powers. and that's why the understanding that already Constantine gave to Pope Sylvester the Lateran Basilica, which had belonged to the army, as a matter of fact, and made a church out of it, tore down what was there and made a church out of it. He gave him also the St. Peter's Basilica and built it for him, and the St. Paul outside the walls. He understood right away that the church had to have an independence. And then Pepin who was back in the 700s, I believe it was, donated the Papal States to the Pope for that very reason, for the same reason. The Pope had already been practically the emperor in the West due to the collapse of society he had practically been the leader of Italy during the just collapse of authority, because the emperor in Constantinople was doing nothing for the Italian situation, in which the Lombards were running up and down the peninsula, and there was just general chaos. The Pope was effectively in charge anyway. And in France and at that time and other parts of Europe, the bishops, owing to the lack of civil authority, were running the country. France is a country that was established by bishops, essentially. They were the authority de facto. It just fell to them. So it was a natural thing that the Pope should receive a central part of Italy in which to function independently. And that was always recognized by the Catholic powers until all of the ideas of the revolution started to flourish in Europe in the 18th century. Then it started to be attacked little by little. The properties of the church were taken away in the revolution. It was terrible. In countries affected by the revolution, Napoleon and all, it was. It's interesting to note that in the restoration that Napoleon made, he gave back all of the properties that were taken from the nobles, but he did not restore the property that had been taken from the church. The church is always the loser in all of these things. There is never a restoration of property to the church. This is the animus of some liberals and people, anti-Catholics, who really want to see the church perish from the face of the earth. Let's be clear about that. They want to see it die. They want to see it die either by a frontal attack, by stripping it of its property and persecuting it, or they want to see it die by transforming it into something that is unrecognizable with regard to its history, in comparison with its historical state. And that's what is happening with the Novus Ordo. They want to see it perish from the face of the earth. And that's the struggle that we're in. And that's why I would say to Novus Ordo conservatives, wake up. I mean, this is no longer any you don't do any good by throwing the chickens to the alligators. These people are the enemies of the church. Wake up and treat them as the enemies of the church, not as misled liberals. See, that's if you really look at the history of this era and the language that these popes are using, I mean, there's no other way to look at the Novus Ordo except as that.
Well, just as a footnote, one of the Norbertine fathers had told me when I was there that the French government very generously offered Prémontré back to the Norbertines for about 1 million francs, very generously offering back property that they had stolen. And there was a real debate in the order because, of course, they wanted Prémontré back as a historical center, but purchasing it would be conceding that the revolution had the right to steal the property and sell it back to them. Ultimately, they decided against. They had the funds, but they couldn't philosophically accept purchasing stolen property back from the French government. And this is the sort of thing that they're offering. I
would have looked at it as an extortion. In other words, I steal your car. If you want it back, you're going to have to pay me.
Exactly.
It's an extortion. It's like mafia.
Well, and as you say, with the church out of the way now, because she's not given the respected temporal power that she needs to operate freely, the state has to assume that. And the Holy Father points this out in 39, 40, and in a legacy form in 48. In 39, he says, and this is again condemned, the state as being the origin and source of all rights is endowed with a certain right not circumscribed by any limits. That's the modern political state as we understand it, as modern. 40, the teaching of the Catholic Church is hostile to the well-being and interest of society. So regressive.
Oh, yes, that's very politically correct today.
And 48, what we could consider a secular value that assumes the level of religion for people. If you think about, well, what are the things that are important to you? Healthcare, education, unemployment, etc. 48, Catholics may approve of the system of educating youth unconnected with Catholic faith and the power of the Church, and which regards the knowledge of merely natural things and only, or at least primarily, the ends of earthly social life. And I know, Your Excellency, Catholic schooling is something you're very passionate about.
Yes, and the whole purpose is to do precisely the opposite. That is to educate them in the necessity of eternal life and ordering your life accordingly. But that's what the Novus Ordo has become. Ecology. You see, that's the latest. We're going to get an encyclical on ecology and environment. When the Easter and Christmas messages are peace on earth, and the Muslims should be nice to each other, or they shouldn't do this or that. It's as if anyone's paying attention to him. As if anyone cared about what he's saying. As if any intervention of these Novus Ordo so-called popes makes any difference. They speak as if they have some authority. Nobody cares about what they say, but they say these things because their religion is secularistic. Their religion is helping man be a better person and helping the earth to be a better place to live in. That's what the Catholicism in the Novus Ordo has become. There's an occasional sprinkling of Christianity in it, and that's the whole idea of the Novus Ordo, is that you can have your secularism, you can have your naturalism, but a little sprinkles on the top of Christianity. That this is really the full message of Christianity is to make the world a better place to live in, and that's what Pius IX is referring to.
Well, there are 80 condemned propositions, and as always, Popes Against the Modern Eras is not meant to be a complete and deep explication of each encyclical we cover. And today, obviously, we covered an encyclical and the Syllabus of Errors, but we'll end with two more propositions, 77 and 80, Your Excellency. 77, in the present day, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be held as the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. And 80, the Roman pontiff can and ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's number 80 is the Bergoglio condemnation.
That's on his coat of arms, I suppose.
Yes, progress, liberalism, and modern civilization.
Right.
So yes, and I would recommend to anybody who's a student of the period and wants to know more about our present problem, you have to study this stuff from the 19th century. This problem in the church has very, very deep roots, and it's almost impossible to read too much about it.
Well, I suppose that's where I would end, Your Excellency. We're at the end of our episode today. Is there anything further, particularly about Pius IX? Because after this, we're on to De Aeternum Illud as our next encyclical. Anything else about Pius IX or about this encyclical that you'd like to comment on?
No, I think we've covered it. Pius IX is certainly a major figure. I think the major figure in the battle against modernism is Pius X. He was the great one. But Pius IX certainly is one of the major figures in the battle against modernism. And that's what this is. This is all a form of modernism. Modernism is to conform the Catholic Church to the modern world. And the modern world is characterized by liberalism. And so all of this is really the same stuff. And if you want to understand what happened in 1958, you have to understand all of these things.
Would you say this is sort of the end of all pretense? You have the as you say, the slitting of the throat, the theft of the papal states, the virtual prisoner of the Vatican. At this point, it's all out war. There's no more hiding and pretending.
Yes, he understood that the program of accommodating liberals was very imprudent, and he made a big switch in 1848. And what Novus Ordo conservatives are doing is accommodating liberals. then they should stop.
And I think that's a good place for us to stop, Your Excellency. Thank you for battling through the remnants of your cold, and look forward to seeing you next month as we continue on in our encyclicals. And get better before then, please.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We want to remind our listeners that Root of the Rot is a production of the Restoration Radio, Root of the Rot. Popes Against the Modern Errors. We were talking about, His Excellency had mentioned, there's deep roots here, and I'm thinking, yes, this is all historically related, and we're thinking about our historical show. But the Popes Against the Modern Errors is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can usually be easily obtained by writing to mail, MAIL, at truerestoration.org. If you have any questions for His Excellency or feedback on this episode, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us at modernerrors@truerestoration.org. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask that if you found the show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time that you pray. For the Restoration, I am Stephen Heiner. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.